the gunnels cured over the weekend, and after I removed the screws, it was time to flip the hull over on these sawhorses. Just a couple sawhorses with some plywood supports that I had to make up to hold the hull since the sawhorses are narrow. You need the sawhorses because the next step I had to get under the boat quite a bit. The next step was to go through all these seams, when every seam all over its length, and make sure the panels were nice and flush where they meet here, and also nice and tight. So I tightened wires where I had to, and by pushing the panels together from inside or out, I could make sure they were even everywhere. I had to replace quite a few wires doing this because once they're tightened up, they're hard to tighten more without breaking. So that was not a big deal. But I went over all these seams, started at the bottom, both sides, went along. I'm just showing you all the seams now. I also cut off the excess wire just to have a little bit less in the way when I epoxy these seams. They're still deathly sharp, all these little wires, so one has to be careful. But I went over all these seams. This is the starboard side. It's kind of a two-step process. I started with tightening all the wires and making sure everything was good there and replacing wires that I had to, and then I kind of went back and double-checked every seam and made sure that the panels were, nice and aligned correctly between the two. That'll just keep it looking nice. And I went over things a couple times so that if anything shifted, I could correct it a second time. I did this on both sides. I just showed you the starboard side. Now I'll run down all these port seams, starting with the bottom. Again, just a little bit of adjustment required, and a little bit of wire tightening to see if I could pull anything more tightly together where it needed to. Mostly if there's a gap, that's just the way it is, the way the panels lie. I'll use a couple thicknesses of epoxy to fill these. That'll be the next step. Fill some very tight seams, like some of these up forward, with unthickened epoxy. And then for the wider seams, kind of like this one, I'll use a thickened mixture in there in between all the wires. I'm not going to epoxy over the wires so that I can pull them out. And here's the last seam on the port side. Be careful not to catch myself on these wires as I walk by, because it's pretty narrow where I'm walking. But I think the hull looks really good. It's nice and aligned. I didn't have to make any real adjustments. Just some fine tuning to try and bring everything as nicely together as I can. I'm going to tape over some of these on the inside just so nothing drips out. Stem came together nicely all along, so I didn't have to adjust anything there. And interestingly, later the stem gets cut off just forward of that gunnel and straight down to the top of the first panel. There's a little piece that gets glued in on the inside. And then once that's in and all set, then I actually cut off this excess to create the actual stem and then shape it. Just for interest. But the stem actually came together really well. It's nice and straight. Panels connect or meet just the way they should. So it's going to make a nice straight stem. So I'm real happy with that. So I have a feeling that could be a problematic area for some builds. At the transom, even though it's wired together at the seams, there was some because the transom sits on top of the panels, it wasn't perfectly flush. So the last step is to go around, push it flush, and put in these little nails as needed to hold it. After finishing tightening the wires and aligning the panels, I glued the panels together with epoxy. It starts with a syringe and unthickened epoxy that I inject into all of these seams, except the ones that were really wide. And then I came back with some thickened epoxy and injected that in all the seams as well, in between the wires. I left the wires so they can be easily pulled. Fill that back in later, or the filleting will take care of it, I'm not sure. This was rather time consuming, took a couple hours. Filled all the seams on the hull and the stem. Filled the stem up pretty well. Worrying a little less about the wires because I want to make sure that that holds really well, because the next step is to pull the wires, so I don't want anything coming apart. But I just worked through all the seams starting at the top, working my way down, injecting the epoxy, and then I cleaned it up, any excess, with a squeegee. That's why you see it on the hull. This will all get cleaned up and sanded at some point, and eventually glassed, of course. So this will cure overnight, and hopefully tomorrow it'll be ready and I can start pulling wires and do the next steps. But that's all that holds the hull together for now. Later steps are filleting on the inside and fiberglass tape on all the insides of the seams. Of course, the bulkheads get filleted and taped in place, and then the outside of the hull is glassed.